We are back at it today, and today we're going to talk about the Second World War and the Holocaust, and how the Holocaust is going to be viewed by nations in the Americas. We're going to start off. I just want you to have some awareness of what's going on before World War II with regard to Jewish immigration to the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th century, tens of millions of Europeans, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, were migrating to the United States to take advantage of new jobs in the industrial economy. Many of these people were Jews that were suffering from pogroms in Russia and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. A pogrom is a government sanctioned attack and riots against a Jewish population. And these types of persecutions were increasing, especially in places like Russia. As more and more people moved into the United States, we're going to start to see nativist sentiments against these new migrants, as fears that they are threatening jobs or American culture, or possibly here to spread communism. And this will lead to some immigration restrictions, like the Immigration Act of 1921, that's going to put quotas on immigration based on percentages of current nationalities that were already in the United States, and the Immigration Act of 1929, that puts hard caps on immigrants from various countries, but largely bars people that are from outside of Western Europe. This is coming at the exact same time as the Great Depression and rising anti-Semitism in Germany with the rise of the Nazi Party. And those two things are very important. At the very time that Jewish people need to escape Germany, they're not going to be able to come to the United States because the United States is going through an economic depression and doesn't feel like it can absorb new migrants in the way that it did in previous decades. So in Germany, now with the Nazis in power in 1935, we see the passage of the Nuremberg laws. These are laws that are going to strip citizenship from Jews, giving them no rights to vote or hold political office. Jews and non-Jews are going to be forbidden from marrying each other. And while this is all going on, the United States is still unwilling to accept new Jewish migrants. By 1938, the exclusion of Jews from life in Germany is nearly complete, where they're excluded from economic and educational opportunities in the German state. In July of 1938, there is an international conference held in France called the Evian Conference that calls out about the Jewish refugee crisis and the need for a place for these people to go. It brings attention to the plight of the Jews in Europe, but no Western nations, despite their sympathy, are going to be willing to open up their doors to embrace these German and Austrian Jews. Things come to a head in November of 1938 with what was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. This is a German pogrom against Jewish synagogues and businesses and homes. And in the end, over 1,000 synagogues are burned. 91 Jews were murdered on the streets of Germany. Over 30,000 Jews would be put in concentration camps. Thousands of businesses destroyed. This action will be condemned by the United States and other nations, but immigration limits are still not lifted. Now, there was an attempt. In 1939, a bill started to move its way through Congress called the Wagner-Rogers Bill that proposed that the United States open itself up to 20,000 Jewish refugee children beyond the quota limits. Most Americans, however, were still in opposition to increasing immigrants, and the bill was defeated. And notice, these are Jewish children. They weren't going to compete with anybody for jobs, but they still were denied entry. And then the MS St. Louis. This is a passenger liner that was filled with hundreds of Jewish refugees escaping Europe with a hope of finding sanctuary in the Americas. At first, they stopped in Cuba with the belief that Cuba would be a stepping stone to get into the United States. Cuba refused their entry. The ship then went to the United States. The United States refused the ship's dockage. Canada did not open itself up for these refugees, and ultimately the St. Louis returned to Europe, returned to Belgium, and sadly, hundreds of those on the ship would ultimately meet their end in concentration camps during the Second World War. Now, once the war began, fears of spies and what are known as fifth columnists. A fifth column, this is a term that was born out of the Spanish Civil War. And these would be like people within your country that are working for the enemy, trying to bring your country down. So fear of spies in America and fifth columnists in America led to further immigration restrictions during the war. In Europe, the Germans would enact a policy of mass extermination of the Jewish population as they expanded their empire in Europe that was known as the final solution. And this began with special units of soldiers that would follow in the German army, the Wehrmacht, through Eastern Europe, rounding up Jews as they went and executing them, in many cases, burying them in mass graves that were previously dug by the Jews themselves. These Einsatzgruppen are responsible for killing nearly 1.5 million of the 6 million Jews that would die in the Holocaust. As Einsatzgruppen continued their murders, Eastern European cities were ghettoized. Portions of cities in Eastern Europe became centers for Jewish populations, and Jews from the city and from neighboring areas were funneled into these ghettos. The largest ghetto was in Warsaw, Poland. And then ultimately, these ghettos would be liquidated or emptied as the Jewish population was relocated to extermination camps, mostly located in Poland. As these Jews were loaded into cattle cars and sent to extermination camps in, like I said, Poland, of which Auschwitz was the largest. They would arrive in the camps to be recorded, and almost immediately, the elderly, the sick, anyone injured, the very young, and their mothers were sent to gas chambers that were cloaked as showers. The remaining population would be used as slave labor within the camp until they could no longer work, at which point they themselves were murdered. And this would lead to upwards of 3 million more deaths of Jews during this era of the Holocaust. Now, while this is all going down, there is news coming out of Europe. There is information coming out of Europe, like the Rayner report, that is going to start to let Western nations know what is happening to Jews in Europe. But the United States is going to be slow to make any kind of official statement of these atrocities. It's not until November of 1942 that the State Department confirms the Nazi plans and executions that are taking place. It doesn't happen until 1944 that the President of the United States, through an executive order, creates the War Refugees Board to organize relief and rescue plans as long as they didn't impede the war effort. The United States would finally increase refugee quotas beyond the immigration quotas that had been previously set. And the War Refugees Board will work for the remainder of the war to aid European Jews in obtaining the documents and the cash they need to get out of Europe. By the end of the war, the US government estimates that upwards of 250,000 Jews would be able to escape Europe with assistance from the American War Refugees Board. Now, an important debate that was had in the United States with regard to what to do with the knowledge of these death camps was whether or not to bomb the extermination camps. For example, to bomb Auschwitz-Birkenau or the railways leading into the camps. On one hand, bombing the camps or bombing the railways might slow down the process of extermination that the Germans were rapidly moving through. On the other hand, these were dangerous flights over enemy territory. They would put pilots and crewmen at risk. And it was ultimately deemed that these were not the most necessary military targets for Allied aircraft, and that the better move was to focus on the most high priority military targets, and that's what would bring the war to a faster end, and that's what would ultimately save more Jews. By 1945, Soviet and Western forces began to liberate concentration and death camps across Germany and Poland in the east. The Nazis would attempt to burn and hide evidence of their atrocities, but there was just too much and it couldn't all be done. In Buchenwald camp in Germany, for example, 20,000 prisoners would be rescued and over 30,000 were found dead within the camp. American General George Patton ordered German civilians from the nearby town to march through the camp to look at what they'd done and actually take part in the moving and burial of bodies. After the war, President Harry Truman would issue another executive order that allowed 16,000 more Jews to enter the United States, and later quotas would be increased even further. Now, with regard to Latin America and the Holocaust, the 1930s saw a lot of immigration restrictions in Latin America as well, as they're dealing with similar anti Semitism that the United States was and economic concerns from the Great Depression. With a look specifically at Brazil, remember we talked about Brazil's role in the Second World War, they severely limited Jewish immigration during the war years. Brazil had a large German minority that made allowing increased Jewish entry politically challenging for President Getulio Vargas, and most requests at entry were denied. After the war, in fact, Brazil became a refuge for many fleeing Nazis, and along with other South American nations. And so Brazil never really accepted too many Jewish refugees in the aftermath of World War II. Canada to our north saw the similar immigration restrictions as we saw in the United States and in Latin America. During the course of the war, only 5,000 Jews would be resettled in Canada. But after the war, though most Canadians did not want to see increased Jewish immigration, many thousands ultimately were going to be able to migrate to the United States or migrate to Canada. And by 1950, about 40,000 Holocaust survivors would be resettled in Canada. That's all for today. We'll talk to you next time.